It was just after midnight on March 8, 2014, when Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 prepared for takeoff. The Boeing 777-200ER, a state-of-the-art aircraft, stood gleaming under the artificial lights of Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Inside, 239 passengers and crew were settling in for a routine red-eye flight to Beijing. There were families, couples, students, business travelers, all unaware that they were about to vanish into one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. At 12:41 a.m. local time, the plane lifted off the tarmac and climbed into the night sky. Communication with air traffic control was normal. The flight crew, led by Captain Zahiri Ahmad Shah and First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, followed all standard procedures. Nothing seemed unusual, weather conditions were good, the aircraft was functioning perfectly. For the first 40 minutes, MH370 flew like any other long-haul flight over the South China Sea. But everything would change in a matter of minutes. At 1:07 a.m., the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS, sent what would be its last scheduled day, a transmission. It reported nothing alarming: fuel status, engine data, everything routine. This is where the silence begins. Just 12 minutes later, something chilling happened. At 1:19 a.m., a Malaysian air traffic controller radioed the cockpit to hand over the flight to Vietnamese control. The pilot's response was simple and calm: "Good night, Malaysian 3 Evans, Eerie." It was not a distress call. There was no hint of concern, no unusual tone in his voice. It was a professional sign-off, exactly what you would expect from an experienced pilot. But that was the last time anyone ever heard from the aircraft. Seconds later, MH370's transponder, the device that identifies a plane on civilian radar, was suddenly turned off. Not failed, turned off. It's a manual action, requiring knowledge of the plane's systems. It's something no pilot would do unless ordered to by air traffic control or in the case of a dire emergency, and even then, they would usually communicate first. But MH370 made no call, no mayday, no emergency signal, just the sign-off, and then silence. In those first few minutes, no one knew anything was wrong. The flight had been handed off to Vietnamese controllers, who expected it to check in within moments. But MH370 never did. As minutes passed with no contact, concern began to grow. Vietnamese authorities tried to reach the aircraft. Malaysian controllers attempted contact as well. Nothing, no response on the radio, no ping from the transponder. The aircraft had simply disappeared from radar over the South China Sea. What makes this moment so terrifying isn't just the suddenness, it's the total lack of any distress or malfunction beforehand. The aircraft didn't slowly lose altitude, it didn't veer off course visibly, it didn't show any signs of mechanical failure. 1 second, it was flying smoothly at 35,000 feet. The next, it had dropped off the digital map, and the only clue. A routine farewell that now carries an unbearable weight. Good night, Malaysian 3 Evans, Eerie. Investigators would later find that the plane's disappearance wasn't caused by a catastrophic failure, not initially. Military radar would later track MH370 making an abrupt left turn, heading back over Malaysia in the opposite direction of its planned flight path. But at the time, no one knew, to the world, the plane had vanished in the sky without a word. The final transmission has since become infamous. Analysts have listened to the audio hundreds of times. Some have tried to analyze the pilot's tone for clues, debating whether the words were spoken by Captain Zahiri or First Officer Farik. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because the truth is terrifying in its simplicity. The flight said goodbye and then disappeared. In an age of constant surveillance, of live streaming everything from shopping receipts to satellite feeds, how can a massive commercial aircraft simply go silent in the night? How can its voice, its only remaining voice, be reduced to a single, unremarkable phrase. That final transmission is more than a goodbye. It's a threshold, the moment where routine ended and nightmare began. After the final transmission from Flight MH370, good night Malaysian Threes, Evans, Aero, air traffic controllers at Sabang in Malaysia expected a routine handoff as the aircraft entered Vietnamese airspace. That handoff never happened. Just 2 minutes after the sign-off, the plane's transponder signal vanished. In one moment, the aircraft was a glowing blip on the radar screen. In the next, it was gone. At first, this wasn't taken as a full emergency. Radar systems occasionally drop signals due to turbulence or equipment interference. But as minutes ticked by with no word, no check-in, and no reappearance on radar, an eerie unease began to spread through the air traffic control centers. Flight MH370 was scheduled to maintain its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, headed northeast across the South China Sea. But behind the scenes, Malaysian military radar had continued tracking something, an unidentified blip that matched the position and speed of MH370. It wasn't visible to civilian radar because the transponder was off. But military-grade systems, relying on primary radar that tracks objects through reflected radio waves rather than cooperative communication, still had eyes on the sky. What they saw shocked them. Instead of heading toward Vietnam, the aircraft made a sudden, dramatic turn to the left, cutting west across the Malay Peninsula. This wasn't a slow drift caused by a systems failure. It was a sharp maneuver, deliberate, coordinated, and stable. Whoever was flying the aircraft still had control. The plane then flew back over Malaysia, turned again near Penang Island, and continued northwest toward the Andaman Sea. No communication was made. No distress signal was sent. It was as if the plane had intentionally disappeared first from sight, then from sound, and now from its intended route. Military officials observed the plane until around 2:22 a.m., at which point it flew out of range and into darkness beyond the radar coverage and into a part of the world where the ocean stretches thousands of miles without interruption. The information wasn't shared with civilian aviation authorities until much later. In the critical hours following the disappearance, the international response was focused in the wrong place, the South China Sea, where the aircraft was last seen on civilian radar. Resources were deployed, search grids drawn, ships dispatched, but MH370 was no longer there. What makes this second point so unsettling is the level of intentionality. Turning off the transponder is not something that happens on accident. It is a physical switch, one a pilot or someone familiar with the cockpit would have to know how to operate. Then, to navigate the plane so precisely across airways and over national borders without triggering a single official response, suggests knowledge, skill, and perhaps most chilling of all, purpose. As the plane slipped westward, it passed over one of Malaysia's most densely populated regions, but it did so silently. There were no lights, no communication, no acknowledgement of its presence. Those on the ground had no idea that a ghost aircraft was flying overhead in the dead of night. And the people inside the plane, 239 passengers and crew, were in an aircraft that had not only gone dark to the world, but now flown completely off its intended path. It is this maneuver, the quiet U-turn and westward flight, that has become one of the central enigmas of the MH370 mystery. It separates a simple disappearance from something darker, something that seems calculated. If the transponder failure had been mechanical, if the aircraft had suffered a catastrophic electrical issue, the systems would have behaved differently. But nothing in the aircraft's behavior suggests chaos. Instead, it suggests control, silent, steady control. And yet, no one claimed responsibility. No passenger was linked to terrorism. No group stepped forward with demands. If it was hijacking, it was the most silent in history. If it was suicide, it was deeply premeditated. If it was something else entirely, then we have no word for it yet. In those early morning hours, while the rest of the world slept, Flight MH370 slipped off the grid, first from radar, then from memory. But the curve it drew through the night sky, bending away from its destiny and into the unknown, remains the most haunting shape in aviation history. A shape that speaks not of accident, but of something intentional, something that wanted to disappear. For days after the disappearance of Flight MH370, search teams were looking in the wrong place. Military radar had tracked the aircraft veering westward over the Malay Peninsula and out toward the Andaman Sea, but that trail too eventually vanished. No wreckage had been found, no signals received. The Boeing 777 had seemingly dissolved into the night sky, as if it had never existed. Then came a breakthrough, strange, faint signals captured not by radar or emergency beacons, but by a satellite thousands of miles above Earth. This would become one of the strangest and most important clues in the entire investigation. The British satellite company Inmarsat quietly revealed that its equipment had been in contact with the aircraft long after everyone believed it had vanished. Not through standard messages, but through what they called handshakes of automated hourly pings between the aircraft and a communications satellite. These handshakes weren't meant for tracking. They were part of a passive, behind-the-scenes system designed for maintenance communication. The plane wasn't transmitting its position. It was simply confirming it was still connected. And yet, these unassuming digital pulses would open a new chapter in the search, one that would stretch across thousands of miles and deeper into mystery. According to Inmarsat, MH370 had sent 7 of these handshake signals after its final radio contact and radar detection. The last was received at 8:19 a.m., almost 7 hours after takeoff. That meant one horrifying fact: the aircraft had stayed airborne for nearly the entire night. No one could explain why. It had enough fuel for approximately that long, so the timeline made sense. But the path it had taken and where it ultimately went were still unknown. It was flying, but to where? This is where the investigation became more complex, because although the handshakes didn't provide exact locations, they did contain tiny timing and frequency shifts, what's known as Doppler data. By analyzing how the aircraft's motion affected the frequency of the signals it was sending to the satellite, experts at Inmarsat were able to estimate 2 broad arcs of possible flight paths. One stretched north across Asia, into Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. The other bent southward into the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. The southern path was more likely, based on several variables, including the lack of radar detection across densely monitored northern territories. And so began one of the most massive, most expensive, and most frustrating searches in modern history. Teams from around the world focused on the Indian Ocean, narrowing the arc using further analysis. They calculated the likely speed and altitude of the plane, examined its fuel burn rate, and tried to simulate what might have happened on board. But the ocean is a graveyard of secrets, deep, cold, and brutally vast. The area they needed to search was larger than most countries. The fact that MH370 stayed in the air for that long only made things more disturbing. If there had been a catastrophic mechanical failure, the aircraft likely would have crashed much earlier. If the pilots were incapacitated, the plane could have flown on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. But the strange mid-air turn, the silence, and the lack of communication didn't fit that narrative perfectly. Someone had likely been in control, for at least part of the time. What was happening in the cabin during those final hours? Were the passengers conscious? Was the crew aware of what was unfolding? Were they alive as the plane banked silently toward its final unknown location? These questions have no answers. The data only tells us that the plane was still in the sky, silent. alone, responding only with ghostly, emotionless handshakes to a satellite far above. Perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Inmarsat pings is not that they existed, but that they were the only remaining proof the plane was still out there. In a world of GPS, radar, real-time tracking, and high-tech communications, the last evidence of MH370's journey came from a system never intended to save lives. It was never meant to trace a plane in crisis, and yet it's all we have, a series of soft, digital echoes reaching from the stratosphere into the abyss. Proof that something was still moving, still flying, long after the world had lost sight of it. The moment it became clear that flight MH370 had disappeared, the world turned to one question: how? A modern aircraft, flown by experienced pilots, vanishing in the age of satellites and constant surveillance, was inconceivable. But when the radar data revealed deliberate turns, when the transponder was found to have been switched off, and when the Inmarsat satellite showed the plane had continued flying for nearly 7 hours without a word, the mystery deepened, and where there are mysteries, theories follow, some grounded in evidence, others in fear. All of them unsettling. One of the most discussed and controversial theories is that of pilot suicide. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, 53, was an experienced and respected aviator with more than 18 0 hours of flight experience. He was known as meticulous, intelligent, and passionate about flying, but like many tragedies, darkness sometimes hides behind routine. Investigators discovered that Zahari had a home-built flight simulator. Forensic analysis of the hard drive revealed that, weeks before the flight, he had simulated a flight path eerily similar to what MH370 would ultimately follow, deep into the remote southern Indian Ocean, ending in a fuel-starved crash. This alone wasn't proof of foul play, but it raised eyebrows. Why practice such a strange, hopeless route in private? Those who support this theory believe Zahari locked the co-pilot out of the cockpit, disabled communication systems, depressurized the cabin to incapacitate passengers and crew, and flew the aircraft into the sea in an elaborate, carefully planned suicide. Chillingly, the turn back across Malaysia and the navigation into a radar blind spot could support that. But others argue it's too neat, too speculative, and lacks a clear motive. His family and friends vehemently deny any suggestion of suicidal behavior, calling him mentally sound and emotionally stable. Another theory is hijacking. Could passengers or even crew members have seized control of the aircraft mid-flight? Investigators looked closely at the passenger manifest. 2 individuals were traveling on stolen passports, but Interpol later confirmed they were Iranian asylum seekers not connected to any terror activity. No group claimed responsibility, no demands were made. If it was a hijacking, it was unlike any ever recorded silent, with no political message, no attempt to land, and no communication with the outside world. That makes this scenario more perplexing than convincing. Some theories take an even darker turn, suggesting a military shootdown. One version suggests that the aircraft strayed into a sensitive area, perhaps over the Andaman or Nicobar Islands, and was shot down, either accidentally or deliberately, by a nation unwilling to admit its mistake. If so, that would explain the silence, the radar shadow, and the international delays in sharing information. But this would require an enormous, long-standing cover-up by multiple governments, none of which has offered credible evidence to support such a claim. Then there's the idea of a massive mechanical or electrical failure. In this scenario, a sudden event disables communication systems, rendering the crew incapacitated or unconscious due to hypoxia, a lack of oxygen caused by cabin depressurization. The plane then continues on autopilot for hours before finally crashing into the ocean when it runs out of fuel. It's plausible, even probable in some cases, but it doesn't explain the early, intentional left turn, nor the disabling of the transponder. Systems don't typically fail in ways that look so coordinated. Human intent still lingers beneath this scenario, even if partially. Other ideas stretch into conspiracy or fringe territory. Was MH370 carrying sensitive cargo? Was someone on board a target of interest to an intelligence agency? Did the aircraft land secretly on a remote airstrip only to be hidden or dismantled? Was it hijacked with technological means, hacked or controlled remotely? There is little evidence to support any of these theories, but in the absence of answers, imagination fills the gaps. What makes the MH370 theories so persistent, so difficult to dismiss, is that every answer leads to more questions. Every explanation carries its own contradictions: the plane's silence, the lack of debris, the bizarre flight path. It all defies normalcy. And in that vacuum of clarity, fear breeds possibility. Was it a calculated act of a desperate man? A botched hijacking, an accident buried under red tape and secrecy, or something the public was never meant to understand? No matter the theory, one fact is inescapable: someone took control of flight MH370, and whatever happened after that, it was carried out with terrifying precision. For over a year after the disappearance of flight MH370, nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no signal, no evidence. Just haunting silence. The ocean had swallowed it, and the world could only speculate. But then, on July 29, 2015, a discovery was made on the shore of Reunion Island, east of Madagascar. A fragment of an aircraft wing, specifically a flaperon, was found washed up on the beach. Investigators quickly confirmed it belonged to a Boeing 777. And there was only one Boeing 777 unaccounted for in the world. It was MH370. This was the first solid piece of physical evidence that the aircraft had indeed gone down in the southern Indian Ocean, supporting the theory drawn from Inmarsat's satellite data. Hope flared again. Families wept, some out of grief, some out of frustration, others in disbelief, but it was just one piece. No fuselage, no cockpit, no black box, no remains, a sliver of a massive machine lost in one of the most remote parts of the Earth. Over the months and years that followed, more debris washed ashore. Fragments of interior panels, parts of engines, wing sections, and cabin materials turned up along the coasts of Mozambique, Tanzania, Madagascar, and Mauritius. Each piece was a cruel reminder that something truly catastrophic had happened, yet these fragments only deepened the mystery. They confirmed the aircraft had broken apart, some on impact, some perhaps due to time and waves, but still, the central wreckage remained hidden. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, vital to understanding what happened in those final moments, were never found. For the families of the 239 souls aboard, the debris gave them no peace. It proved only that their loved ones were gone, not how or why. The Malaysian government's final investigation, released in 2018, could not determine a definitive cause. It acknowledged the transponder was intentionally switched off, that the aircraft's final movements suggested human intervention, but stopped short of assigning blame. The conclusion, in essence, was that the mystery remained unresolved. Grief turned to outrage for many of the victims' families. Some accused the Malaysian government of incompetence, others of a cover-up. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were demanded. Vigils were held year after year on the anniversary of the flight's disappearance, with candles lit, names read aloud, and children holding signs with photographs of fathers, mothers, and siblings who never came home. The pain did not fade. If anything, it sharpened with each passing year without answers. Search operations continued in phases, with international coalitions contributing ships, sonar equipment, and deep sea drones. The first major search, led by Australia, covered more than 120 zero square kilometers of ocean floor, one of the largest search efforts in aviation history. It was suspended in 2017 after turning up nothing. A private U.S. company, Ocean Infinity, took up the mission again in 2018 using advanced unmanned submarines. They searched tens of thousands more kilometers, but still, the wreckage eluded them. The Indian Ocean had become a cold tomb, vast and indifferent. As the years passed, the mystery of MH370 became more than just a news story. It became a symbol of how fragile even the most advanced systems can be, of how quickly confidence can be shaken, of how 239 people could vanish in an era where planes practically fly themselves. The families continued to fight, to dig, to demand, but their voices echoed against an ocean that offered only silence in return. Some say the answers are still out there, buried under layers of water and time. Others believe we may never know. The wreckage, if found, might not tell us the full story. The black boxes, if they exist intact, may have long since lost their data. Or perhaps the truth is something we're not ready to confront, something darker, more complex, more human. And so the world moves on. Flights continue, oceans are crossed, satellites orbit, and systems hum in the background. But somewhere out there, deep beneath the surface, or perhaps locked away in a file never meant to be opened, the story of Flight MH370 waits. A story of silence, of fragments scattered across distant shores, and of families who still leave a light on in case the sky gives them something back.